So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Validating Einstein for Life Sciences session, Healthcare and Life Sciences. My name is Rosalind Beasley, and I like to call the digital transformation leader in the life sciences space. And I know a lot of times people say, well, what does that really mean? It means that I've been helping organizations move their GXP-related applications to the cloud for quite some time, for the past 10 years. And I would say that my greatest achievement on the Salesforce platform was actually introducing the first GXP QMS system to the App Exchange back in 2012. And that application is still in use by many large pharma and med device organizations today. And I'd also like to give a shout out to two individuals in the audience who actually helped me achieve that goal back then. That company was 123 Compliance. It was acquired about 4 years ago by one of the major players. And so now I'm out on my own again and starting up a new venture. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about Einstein Vision. So let's go ahead and get started. I always have to say, before we get started, we have to talk about some housekeeping. Forward-looking statement, any and all purchasing decisions should be made based on currently available features in the Salesforce ecosystem. So anything that I might say or do in the demonstrations today should not be used for your purchasing decisions. So what are we going to do today? What's the road we're going to travel? I'm basically going to walk you through a use case for Einstein Vision in the life sciences arena. And I hope that you enjoy that use case. It's one that I'm very familiar with. It's one that I actually am very fond of because I know the challenges of that particular process without a vision and a tool like Einstein Vision in place. We'll start with some terminology just so everyone level sets on what Einstein Vision is and what it can do for you, and then we'll move forward with a demonstration. The demonstration is going to walk through how we can use Einstein Vision to do some predictions, but at the same time I'm going to show you what I did to achieve that from an API perspective in the code. And finally, I'll end with some validation testing and testing tips. So how many people in the audience are in the life sciences space? I'm excited to see that. And how many are developers? I was actually expecting the opposite, but I'm happy to see that there's lots of life sciences folks here since this is a developer track. But I think I organized it so that it's going to be useful to both. So one other thing, who's used Einstein Vision? 3. All right, awesome. So we'll go ahead and get started. Talk about the use case. So what are we going to do today? We're going to perform some predictions for a medical device. And in order to do that, we need to understand what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be predicting the characteristics of a medical device based on images that we have. And some of those characteristics you see there are that device could be discolored, or it may not be discolored at all, clear. Its surface could be textured or smooth, and it may have a blemish such as an incision, and it could possibly be deflated. And based on that grid, we can determine whether or not the device is potentially defective. So if you haven't figured it out yet, we're trying to determine whether or not a device is defective. And so, for example, if the device is discolored, textured, doesn't have a blemish, and it's not deflated, chances are it's not a defective device. However, it is a defective device because it's discolored. There's no reason it should be discolored. Let's skip down to, let's say it's a clear device, has a smooth texture, but it has an incision. Any guesses on, well, I told you, it's definitely not a defective device. Why is that? Because we know it has an incision. And if a device has an incision, it is likely caused by a surgeon. So we would consider it not a defective device. Anyone care to guess what the device is? It can deflate, possibly during surgery, or, all right, I'll give you a hint, see who can figure it out. Any takers now? Yes, it's a breast implant. And many years ago, I worked for an organization where we sold some pretty high-profile pharmaceuticals as well as medical devices, one being breast implants, the other being the lap band device. You could probably figure out who that is. So one of the things that we had a lot of challenges with, and not necessarily technical challenges, although those were many as well, was the return device inspection process. So because breast implants are obviously implantable, they go under a lot of scrutiny, and they're class 3 devices, so they're considered extremely risky devices. And when they're returned to us, we had to basically inspect each and every device. So typically that process started out with a healthcare provider contacting our service desk and explaining what the problem was with the device. And if the service desk individual wasn't able to resolve the issue, we would then go ahead and have that case person go ahead and create either a complaint or a case, or in some cases both. But that case would go ahead and get created, and then we would potentially create a complaint. But at the same time, we had a need for the device to be returned. And so basically we would be waiting for the device to return, but once it was returned, we'd go ahead and receive it into the system. So you'd have basically a case, a complaint lodged against that particular device. It could be multiple devices. In this case, it could be 1 or 2 or 3, depending on what happened during the surgery. And once that device is received, it goes through a process of being sterilized or autoclaved. And then the device would then go ahead, and we would go ahead and start the visual inspection. And during the visual inspection, we literally had individuals who would take pictures of the devices. And they would take multiple pictures and try and determine visually what happened to the device. Was it literally defective and we need to send this information on to another department? Or was it potentially an issue that was caused during surgery by the physician, in which case we would want to get back to the healthcare provider and provide some feedback on that as well. And then from there, we would move on to potentially a final inspection and, if need be, forward that information on to other individuals within the organization. For example, that information would flow back into the complaint, to the safety group, to the quality group, and to the regulatory group, depending on whether or not it needed to be reported to the FDA. So that's the process that we're going to walk through today. We're going to focus on the visual inspection, and that's where I see the most value for a product like Einstein Vision, because that is the process that we were doing manually at the time, and we could potentially remove that individual and free them up for other activities. So before we get started, let's talk about some terminology. Who here would be able to describe Einstein Vision and what it is? I think there's 3 people who could take a stab at it, but they're not volunteering, so, okay.
So Einstein Vision is a piece of software that will take images and some other things, and you give it 2 different collections, a learning set and a set that's to be determined, and it goes through the learning set and tries to decide how to figure out how the image matches a certain thing, and then you apply it to the rest of the set, and typically you verify that it works.
Perfect. and he stole my thunder. So it's an image classification algorithm, deep learning algorithm, and a service basically that you can use to classify images. We'll walk through an actual demonstration of that. And thank you to the gentleman for providing the answer. I won't repeat it because I'm literally going to walk through it. So we just sort of described what Einstein is. But so how does Einstein know what that image is? It starts out with basically a data set. And I chose to provide you with this particular image primarily because when you provide, Einstein has to be provided with a set of data. And you will set of data to Einstein in the form of folders and subfolders. So you're pre-classifying the data for Einstein. And for example, if you wanted to send an image to Einstein and determine whether or not it was a bicycle or a motorcycle, you would essentially send a folder with named cycles, and within it a subfolder bicycle and motorcycle. Now, don't be concerned, that's not our use case today. It was just an easy way to describe a data set. So once you have that data set, you upload it to Einstein Vision for training. And during that process, Einstein is going to create a model. And that model will consist of labels and rules that it'll use to perform predictions. But that's all behind the scenes. Einstein's going to do that for you. And the model basically consists of labels. And those labels will literally have the same name as the folders that you created. So you pre-classified, you created labels. Einstein's going to use those in the model. So in this case, you'll see that the model might have those two particular labels. So once you have the model created, Einstein's created the model, you can now ask your users to go ahead and use Einstein to make predictions. So if I wanted to at this point, I could go ahead and send an image over to Einstein, and Einstein would predict what the image contains. I think an important note about Einstein Vision is that it can only predict what it knows. So if you send something that's totally not within your classified data set, it's not going to attempt to tell you what that is. It's just simply going to misclassify it as something it isn't with an extremely low probability. So once you send that image to Einstein Vision, basically it's going to make the prediction. And when it sends the information back to you, it's going to send the label and the probability of that prediction being true. And in this case, Einstein, we sent him over a picture of a bicycle, and he determined that he's 95% sure that the photo is a photo of a bicycle. All right, so that's really all you need to know. The rest of it, we're going to get into the details, but that's a high level of the terminology. So as I walk through, you'll know what we're talking about. So if you're a developer, this is of extreme interest to you. If you're not, somebody else is taking care of it for you. But there's some steps that you need to take in order to start working with Einstein Vision. The first is you need to activate Einstein in an org. And you'll do that by going to the sign-up page that I have there on the screen. And actually, at the end of this presentation, I have a resource that you can go to get everything you need regarding Einstein. But once you've activated Einstein, during that process, you're going to be provided with a key. And it's important that you not only, you need to download that key. Don't think you shouldn't download the key. Because you're going to need to upload it into the org that you activated Einstein in. So once you've taken care of that step, a couple of other housekeeping things you need to do. In order to communicate with the Einstein service, you need to have a remote site setting that points to the Einstein URL. That's step number 4 there. And then something I think you should really consider is using the Einstein Apex wrapper. And the reason why you want to do that is it's going to abstract the API for you. So you don't need to know every single detail of the API if you're using the wrapper. The wrapper is basically going to take a lot of code, thousands and thousands of lines of code, and provide you with methods that you can call a single call to a method and, for example, create a data set or make a prediction. And then finally, there's a custom setting that you have to update, which is essentially your email address. And it needs to be the same email address that you used when you activated the account. So one of the first things we talked about was creating a data set. And that process is pretty straightforward from an end user perspective. Typically, that's not going to be your business process end user, obviously. Since you're going to be working in a validated environment, if you're in life sciences, you know exactly what that means. You're going to want to make sure that only specific individuals should be able to create data sets. Interestingly, you can create data sets, you can delete data sets, and you can train them. When you upload it, it's just uploaded. It's not trained yet. But once you train it, that's when Einstein goes ahead and creates the model. And then you can start predicting against the model. One other note of importance is you can have multiple data models for a data set. And so one of the things that I've done to kind of manage that is in Salesforce. See if I can get that to switch. Just one second. Okay. A little bit of a delay here, but basically, so I mentioned that you could have multiple models available. It's still a little slow here, but that's fine. I created a give me a second here. I created a custom setting that basically allows me to manage the models. So if I had a particular model that I felt I wanted to use, it's been validated, it's ready for use in production, I'm setting the name of that model and the model ID in a custom setting. And the reason why I'm doing that is just sort of keeping version control of the model. So we're going to get into some live demos in a moment, but before we go there, it's important that you know that Einstein Vision is obviously a classification engine, but it doesn't have a UI. There's no user interface. So when I asked how many folks in the audience were developers, that was for a reason. If you're going to use Einstein Vision, you're going to need a developer to create a UI around it. There are in the trailhead some examples that you can look at and you could start with to help you understand the API. But you're going to need to create for example, you'll need to create an API for the back end, which is creating the data set, training the data set, and you'll also need some code to actually customize your front end to also do the predictions. So just so you're aware of that. And in this case, I'm using what's called the Einstein Prediction Service class. And that class is basically, if you're a developer, your entry point into the Einstein Vision API. It's going to handle a lot of the intricacies that you would have to deal with on your own. And that's using that Apex wrapper that I talked about, the Einstein Vision Apex wrapper. But once you've created that class instance, you can then call methods such as create dataset from URL sync. And that's basically going to go out to a public URL where you've placed your data set, grab it, pull it in, and create the data set. And you'll notice that you create URL sync, but that's for small data sets. You're going to want to use an asynchronous call. It's essentially very similar to this one, which is create data set from URL async. Very similar. The difference is you'll be well prepared for larger data sets. So in the example that I'm going to show you, it's an extremely small data set for the purpose of the demo. Typically, your data set for each label, you probably want 1,000 images. So that would help Einstein to be able to predict better. The next one, essentially, is another call, very similar, which is a call to the train dataset method. And we pass it the dataset ID and the dataset name. And Einstein does everything else. So that's for the developers in the audience. You'll notice that it returns a model. And from that model, we can pull things like the label, the model name, the status, whether it's running or not, and the progress. So you can keep track of the progress of the training itself. So let's talk about what a lot of people are here for, GXP compliance. So if you are in life sciences and you think you want to use Einstein Vision, there's a couple of housekeeping things that you need to do before you embark down this road. 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. Who's familiar with it? I would imagine a lot. Electronic records management and electronic signatures. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the system now to sort of talk about those. So I will go to, I have a device return object, and in that object, I have some records. And you can see in this particular case, the device is awaiting visual inspection. You can see that from the path. I have received it. It went from awaiting to receive to visual inspection. That's all done, obviously, through out-of-the-box Salesforce path. But the challenge that you have in life sciences is that you kind of need to keep track of what people are doing, not just what changes they made to data, but what actions did they perform. And so we have two buttons here that a user can use to progress this record. So for example, request image training or complete a visual inspection. Once the user clicks on one of those buttons, their action's being recorded. That's something you definitely have to include functionality like this in Salesforce in order for you to be compliant. An example, for example, we have an action log here that shows the history of this record from an action perspective, a business process action perspective. So you can see that the record went from an awaiting to received status, and that action was performed by the receiving user. And then it went from received to visual inspection, and that action was performed by the visual inspection user. Other things that make you CFR 21 Part 11 compliant is the out-of-the-box audit trail history. So, for example, what just happened there when I said I wanted to request training, an electronic signature popped up. And it's basically saying you can't progress until you answer this, until you prove who you are, and that you understand the action that you're taking. That is extremely important in a GXP environment. So I just wanted to cover that, just so you understood that if you're going to implement something like an Einstein Vision, you really need to take into consideration 21 CFR Part 11. So I'm going to move on to the next part of the demonstration, and you'll see that I have two things highlighted here. In my device return record, I have the visual inspection area on the detail page, and that's describing some of the characteristics that we saw earlier. And in addition to that, on the right-hand side, you can see I have the ability to upload an image to classify an image. Interestingly, the section on the right side of the screen, classify image, that is a lightning component. So that was developed using Aura components as well as Einstein Vision. So let's go ahead and perform the visual inspection. Let me just exit out of there real quick. So I'm going to go back to the detail page. And you'll see in this particular case, I haven't actually classified the image yet. But let's go over to our component here, our lightning component. And I'm going to click Upload Files. And I'm going to select an image that I know Einstein hasn't seen before. So as a visual inspection user, I can have Einstein go ahead and perform that prediction for me. And you'll see that Einstein's pretty confident about the prediction he's made. He's predicting that with 98% probability that the device I just uploaded is a breast implant that is clear, smooth, it's not deflated, and it has no blemishes. And in addition, I used Process Builder to go ahead and populate a few of the other fields, the characteristics, because you're going to want to use those for analytics later. One other thing to note, which is extremely important in a GXP environment, is as a developer and also as a SME, I knew I also needed to attach the actual image to the record. Because as you know, during an inspection, someone will ask, may I see the photos? And so I know in the past, without something like an Einstein, we were literally just managing files in drives. And that was very challenging during an inspection. So we've uploaded the file to to Salesforce and attached it to the record. And you can see the prediction was definitely correct. That's a clear breast implant with no blemishes. And the possibility of a defect was set to no based on the characteristics. That was also something that I did through Process Builder based on the prediction that Einstein had returned. So let's talk a little bit about what the developer needs to do in order to make the prediction. So you saw that on the right-hand side of the screen, there was the classify device image. That is a custom lightning component. It was created specifically for this demo, but I had options I had the choice of predicting using a blob or a base 64 or a URL. I chose, you'll see in the next slide, to use predict blob. And so when I use the predict blob method, I needed to pass it the model ID and the actual file, and Einstein did the rest. But in doing so, Einstein also returned some results, and I was able to use those results then to populate the detail page. And so, for example, the probability, there's a attribute called label, or property called label, and that returns the actual prediction. And then there is a probability, and that returns how likely the prediction was correct. So now it gets interesting. So we've uploaded our data set, we've trained the model, and we've made some predictions. But how do we validate that it's actually working? Well, the good news is Einstein comes with some metrics that you can use during your validation process to confirm that, or to verify that it's predicting at the level that you want. And one of those metrics is the confusion matrix. And the confusion matrix is basically showing you how often Einstein is predicting correctly and how often Einstein is predicting incorrectly. And that's based on a process that it uses, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, to train the data. But on the left-hand side, you have what's actually expected from the data set. And then on the right-hand side, the matrix is what was predicted. And if you marry those two up, you can see in some cases the prediction was not correct. And Einstein's telling you that that prediction was not correct. And in this case, it's saying that a clear device was incorrectly predicted as a discolored device. Other metrics that you'd be interested in are the test accuracy. And it's basically a measure of how accurate the testing was, the testing that Einstein performed. And then also the training of the model, how accurate was Einstein when it was training itself. That'll become a little bit more clear in the next slide, but just wanted to let you know that those are some of the metrics you have as a developer to present back to your QA team for validation. And just a sort of a key note here, that test accuracy is the overall accuracy of Einstein's predictions. It's not necessarily something you should take for granted, because your data set might be imbalanced and you might know that, but you can also use an F1 score, and the F1 score sort of takes into account that you might have more of one set of images than another. The likelihood of, for example, a device with an image is slim, so you would have fewer of those. And so Einstein has less data to test, to train with. So those performance metrics are returned in a set of arrays, and then it's up to the developer to present them back to you. And so you can see you have a list of arrays for the confusion matrix, the labels, the F1 scores, etc. Any developers here used any of the performance metrics? Yeah. So a couple of more things we need to talk about in our last 5 minutes here is the couple of more things related to computer systems validation. We'll start with the concept of splitting data. So I didn't mention this earlier, but when Einstein's going through its training process, it took your data set and it split it for you. It left a portion of it for testing. And so you'll see at the top portion of this screen, we have sort of the model training And you'll see that Einstein basically split that data into training and a validation data set. And he used that to train himself. And separate from that, you're going to need a third data set, just because of the world we live in life sciences. If you could imagine, as you're training, you're probably retraining your model, right, to get Einstein to be more accurate. Well, you don't want to use that same data set when you do your validation. You want to send Einstein some images it's never seen before, and then you move on to production, right? And apologies for the use of the word validation here, but that's more of a machine learning term. Don't think of it as your life sciences validation. So when I mentioned that Einstein splits the data for you, your initial data set, it's going to by default split it 90-10. So it's going to train on 90% of it, and it's going to, it's going to use 10% of the data to train, and 90% for the model. You can change that by changing the training parameters. If you want it to split 60-40, 70-30, or whatever that number per ratio happens to be, you can do that. But it's important that you know Einstein's doing that for you. So I know there's a lot of things mixed into what I talked about today, but I want to kind of walk through why we walked through it the way we did and and what the takeaways were. So if you're working on validating your system, some of the planning you want to do up front is, what's the acceptable test accuracy that you're willing to accept? Einstein's never going to be 100% accurate. So as an organization, you have to decide, am I comfortable with it being 90% accurate, 95% accurate? Do I want to use test accuracy versus the F1 score to determine whether or not it's acceptable? What's the sample size that you want to use? You're going to have to define that up front. I said at a minimum, 1,000 images per label would be good. You also want to make sure that you've identified ratio is. 90-10 is probably not what you're going to want to do unless you've got massive amounts of data. And then training feedback process. You can have users send to Einstein for training as part of the business process. But that's something you have to decide whether you want to do or not, or keep it controlled. Have the images that were inaccurately predicted by Einstein sent off to someone behind the scenes, and they retrain the model, and then it goes into production again. Model versioning, I mentioned that I used a custom setting, but you could certainly use other options, but you're going to want to make sure that you're keeping track of which model is available in production. And then I'm going to end with sort of formal testing. I mentioned it earlier. You're going to have to test the admin UI. You're going to have to test the end user UI. And the reason why I presented you with those performance metrics is you can use the performance metrics to automate your validation process, make it a little easier for yourself. And then finally, 21 CFR Part 11, I gave you some examples of how you can make your application compliant with GXP regulations. I know it was a lot of information packed into a small session, but thanks for everyone for attending.